Many Christmases ago, when neither you or I were born or bred, there lived a man named Percival Grave, an apt name if ever there was, for the man's nature and profession. For Percival Grave was a serious and solemn man, and was also a gravedigger in his local churchyard. But it was said that on one Christmas Eve night, Percival Grave changed his ways, for on that night he made his way to the churchyard with a spade in one hand and a lantern in the other. As he walked along the old cobbled streets, he could see the warm lights gleaming through windows. He cursed at the joyful din and laughter at every home he passed, before pausing outside his sister's house, whom he hadn't spoke to for many years. As he walked on, he approached a group of carol singers standing on the corner under a gaslit lamp. He stood and listened for a short while, before shaking his head with disdain and disapproval and walking on, taking a few gulps of whiskey from a small bottle he kept inside his coat pocket. It wasn't long before he came to the dark lane that led to the churchyard gates, and as he trudged along from the dark bushes on either side of the lane, he began to hear chuckles of laughter and faint whispers, "Merry Christmas, Percival Grave, Merry Christmas." "Who's there?" scowled Percival Grave, raising his lantern, but nobody answered. Before long he reached the churchyard gates. He placed his lantern and spade on the ground, then reached for the padlock with his key, but as he did so, the round plate of solid metal for just a second morphed into a ghostly face. Percival Grave stood back with a start in disbelief, then reached inside his coat jacket for his whiskey bottle. He took a large gulp, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, staring at the lock, before chuckling to himself at his own vivid imagination. He then proceeded to unlock the padlock. Once inside, he padlocked the gates behind him, and in the moonlight set to work on an unfinished grave. After an hour or so, despite the hardened earth caused by the frost, the grave was finished. Percival Grave sat on a tombstone opposite the one he had just dug, drinking his whiskey. He looked around the still and quietness of the graveyard. "You lot are the lucky ones," he said. "You're better off down there than up here, I can tell you." "Is that what you really think?" came a voice from a ghostly figure sitting on the tombstone next to the grave he had just dug. Percival Grave stood up in astonishment at the ghostly sight. "Is that what you really think?" said the ghost once more. Percival Grave was for once in his life lost for words. "Why are you such a miserable, scornful man? Why do you hate life so much?" Because life has not been kind or fair to me, Spirit." "And you think life has been more kinder and fairer to everybody else here, buried in these graves?" "Yes, I do," said Percival Grave, "'cause they're dead and buried, out of it." "So you would not object to swapping one of these lives for yours, so that they might live again?" "Not one bit," said Percival Grave. A cold wind blew then across the churchyard, and whispers of "Merry Christmas, Percival Grave, Merry Christmas" echoed around the tombstones. "Well," said Percival Grave nervously, looking all around him, "such a thing is not possible anyways, so I'll be on my way. Good night." "Isn't it?" said the ghost. "Look down there into the grave you have just dug, and tell me what you see." Percival Grave tentatively walked over and peered down into the grave. "Nothing," said Percival Grave. "There's nothing but mud and worms." "Look again," said the ghost. When Percival Grave looked the second time, he saw himself lying there, stiff and dead as a dodo, with his hands across his chest and 2 penny coins covering his eyes. Percival Grave lurched back in horror. "But how can that be?" "It can be," said the ghost, "and will be. By the end of the 12th chime for midnight, your name will appear on the headstone by the grave you have dug for yourself." At that very moment, the church clock struck the first chime for midnight, and as it did, the letter P engraved itself into the headstone. "No!" gasped Percival Grave, turning from the headstone to the ghost. But the ghost was no longer there. As the second chime rang out, an E engraved itself next to the P, followed by an R. "No!" shouted Percival Grave. "I've changed my mind. Do you hear me, spirit? I've changed my mind. I want to live." And as the words "I want to live" left Percival Grave's lips, something changed inside him. "I want to live," he muttered to himself. And as the next chime rang out, Percival Grave picked up his spade and lantern and ran as fast as he could towards the churchyard gates, shouting all the time, "I want to live! I want to live!" He fumbled for the keys in his pocket and quickly opened and locked the gates behind him, counting the chimes as he did so. "That's 8, he said, quickly making his way up the dark lane, and just as he reached the lamplit street, he heard the 12th chime. Percival Grave stood still, looking down at his body, unsure if he was dead or alive. Then he slowly raised his head and saw a reflection of himself in a shop window. The face he saw was of a wrinkled old man whose heart had grown cold, a heart that had forgotten how to live and love. He touched his face sorrowfully with his hands, and then saw a reflection of himself as a young boy on one Christmas Eve night, excitedly running through the snow with his sister, throwing snowballs. "All those years," he muttered to himself, "wasted." Percival Grave wiped away a tear rolling down his face, then turned and walked along in the snow, stopping at his sister's house before tentatively knocking on the door. His sister opened the door and on sight of seeing her brother, gasped with surprise. "Forgive me, sister, for calling so late," said Percival Grave, "but I wanted to inquire on how you and your family are keeping." Percival Grave's sister stared at him in amazement, then smiled warmly, welcoming him into her home. But as they stood on the doorstep, a group of carolers appeared before them, with a lantern held high, singing Christmas hymns. Percival Grave and his sister stood smiling with joy and happiness beating in their hearts. And as Percival Grave looked on at the carolers, he noticed a familiar figure standing amongst them, the spirit from the graveyard. The spectre gave Percival Grave a nod and a wink as it sung, then unbeknown to everybody else, slowly evaporated into the falling snow.